Okay, so we are going to get started. Hello, everyone. So this webinar is on anti-Black racism and child protection in Ontario. Next slide, Helda. Oh, there we go. So I first want to start off with a land acknowledgement. I know folks are tuning in from different spaces and places. So typically when I do a land acknowledgement, I try not to read off of a piece of paper, as I've been taught by the Indigenous folks who have been close to me and educated me around my responsibilities in Black and Indigenous solidarity. So for myself, where I'm located in Toronto. I am in the space that is governed by the Treaty of One Dish with One Spoon, which was a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of New Credit to govern themselves under the principles of respect, friendship, and peace. I know folks, again, are tuning in from different spaces, so I do implore that you go and look into who were the original peoples of the space that you occupy or are currently on, and what responsibilities do you have. Another way in which I've been educated around acknowledging not necessarily just the land, but also the relations I have with the people here as a Black person is to complicate the idea of settlerhood, that Black people aren't just here as settlers, we are here as for settlers, or as I've heard Angela Robertson say, we are stolen people on stolen land. And so we have a complicated relationship as Black diasporic people in this space and place that we call Canada. And as well, when I think about acknowledging my relationship to this land and the people originally from it, I also think about specifically within this current issue of child welfare, the impact of child welfare and social work as a practice on Indigenous nations. And when we talk about the lack and death and dying that happens within child welfare or because of child welfare, and I also have in the front of my mind moments in history or continued moments in history, such as the 60s scoop, residential schooling, the current moment we're in, where we call it the Millennium Scoop, where there's actually more Indigenous children and youth in care than there were during the 60s scoop. And when we talk about individuals that are Black and survive and experience child welfare, I also remember names such as Tina Fontaine. And when she was murdered, she was also supposed to be in state care. And so there's certain questions and thoughts that we need to ask ourselves as we consider Black and Indigenous solidarity and our relationship to this land. So before I get into who I am, I do see that there was the question around if it's going to be recorded. This is going to be recorded, and we will be posting it later on. So for folks who might have to end up leaving, the hope is to have this posted sometime soon. So my name is Josh Lamers. My pronouns are he, him. I am currently a social justice fellow at the Black Legal Action Center. It's a 10-week fellowship, so it is a limited time at BLAC, but it's been a great time getting to work alongside these folks. I'm also currently going into second year of law at the University of Windsor. I have a Bachelor, Master of Social Work. I'm a community organizer, activist. I would consider myself a coming to scholar when it comes to writing about Black life here in Canada and about certain issues. I'm also a co-founder of a few things. One of them relevant to this conversation is a co-founder of the collective Child Welfare Survivors alongside folks like Tyler Dixon. So who is BLAC? So the BLAC team is made up of many individuals, but doing a lot of hard work for an entire province. So we have Ruth Goba as executive director. We have Lisa Francis, who is actually, folks can see Lisa right now. She's the office manager. We have Nana Yanful, who's the legal director. She's currently on leave. We have Frida Adam, who's a staff lawyer. Trisha Suleiman, who's a staff lawyer. Mood Mengesha, he's our research and policy coordinator. And we have Khalda Saleh, who is our community legal worker, and Khalda's right there. So BLAC's vision is a society where anti-Black racism is named, meaningfully addressed, where the humanity and dignity of Black people are centered, where the laws and the legal system are reflective of the real experiences of Black people, and where racial equity and full participation of Black people in society is achieved. So BLAC is funded by Legal Aid of Ontario. BLAC is a specialty clinic, that's specifically for Black folks in Ontario, but it also provides hybrid services where where we also provide individual and systemic legal services. Our mandate is for low and no income folks in Ontario. Again, we do individual and systemic work specific to anti-Black racism as well. So that has implications for the areas of law that they do work around. Is the provincial mandate for Ontario, and the areas of law that is practiced. The areas of law that BLAC does cover is education law, housing, human rights, employment, prison law, social assistance, so ODSP, OW, CPP, and they work with police complaints. So, so the areas of law that BLAC does not do are criminal law, family law, but with claims of discrimination, they can take that on and provide complaint procedure advice and summary legal advice, as well as immigration and refugee law. So here is the intake process. There is an intake process at BLAC. Right there is the contact information, there's the phone numbers or the email. If you do go to the website, it shows you the hours. There is a financial eligibility requirement, meaning that there's a certain threshold that if you make above a certain income, you won't be eligible because again, it's a low to no incomes. It's for low to no income folks. And lawyers do try to call back within 2 to 3 business days of you engaging BLAC, and support persons are welcome. And that includes, our lives have moved online. So that includes with phone calls and such. So this is, we have 2 hours together, and I'm trying to manage time well. So there's 2 halves of the webinar. The first half is more technical. It's not going to be a critical take on child protection. It is just going to be trying to inform you as to what child protection is. How does it say it's supposed to function? What are the usual steps within child protection and child welfare? If folks do have questions, you can ask the questions throughout. I personally will not be looking at the Q&A. I will be paying attention to the slides. And then there will be a question period between the 2 halves where I can answer questions relevant specifically to this part. So if people start asking questions of, well, what do you think about this or what do you think about that? I will not be answering those kinds of questions right now because I'm not dealing with that topic just as of yet. So, in the first half, we're going to be talking about what is child protection, such as, what is Bill 89, which is the bill that governs. What are the rights of children and youth and parents? What are obligations of child protection workers and agencies? When is a child and youth considered to be in need of protection? What are the functions of a CAS? When can legal representation or support come in? What can BLAC do? What are the steps of a child protection investigation, specifically family-based? I'll explain what that means later. What are the possible decisions? What are the child protection worker evaluation tools? So how are BLAC families being evaluated? What are the possible decisions that can happen in a child protection case and proceeding? And what are the reviews, what is the review and complaint process? As a part of this first half, we'll also be talking about what is kind of like the life of a general child protection case. Then the second half of the webinar, so that's where there will be the critical take. Maybe the reason why a lot of folks have come here today. Defining anti-Black racism, misogynoir, anti-Black Zionism, and colonialism. Describing and talking about the history of Black families from the slave trade to now. Anti-Black racism for parents, family, and caregivers. Talking about anti-Black racism for children and youth as child welfare survivors. Talking about anti-Black racism for child protection lawyers and workers, talking about what has BLAC experienced when it comes to child protection, and what is the current shape of child protection. Throughout this, I will be citing certain spaces and places and people. I didn't put that on the slides, frankly, because of the way that the slides was allowing me to put in content. It was just too much. At the end, there are spots that say resources and references, and that will also be made public along with these slides. Some aspects of the slides will have things pulled out because some of the things that I'm citing are coming from people's forthcoming work, and so including myself, and so some of these things will be pulled out. So what is child protection in Ontario? So Bill 89, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act from 2017, is the bill that governs in a large part child protection. In 2017, there was a huge apparent overhaul of the former bill, and that's where you see the kind of the paramount purpose, where it says the paramount purpose of this act is to promote the best interest, protection, and well-being of children. Through there, as long as child protection workers are ensuring that first paramount purpose, there are other purposes said in the act, such as providing aid to parents, using the least intrusive means, using attentive and respectful services. Again, throughout this part, I am not going to be reading to you folks from the act. It's just not possible, especially since we only have 2 hours. So we as BLAC are publishing 2 documents. One is a kind of know your rights document. Another one is a navigating child welfare. And so those will have more information and will also point you in the direction for further information should you need it. So in terms of child protection in Ontario, we also have something such as the duty to report, which means that for children and youth who are 15 years of age and younger, you must, should you suspect that there's issues of maltreatment, abuse, or neglect, you must, as adults, so 18 and up, you must report to CAS your suspicion. For youth who are 16 and 17, it is not a must, it is a may, so you may report to CAS, but if you have a suspicion, but it's not a must. Throughout this presentation, I'm gonna, and frankly, in general, when I say child protection equals child welfare equals Children's Aid Society. I am often using them interchangeably. Folks might not do that elsewhere. I will be doing that a lot throughout this presentation. So Children's Aid Societies, just so folks know, Children's Aid Societies themselves can be specific to the location of Children's Aid, of the Children's Aid Society, such as Children's Aid of Toronto. They can be faith-based oriented, such as Catholic CAS, Jewish CAS. They can be specific to a community, such as Native Child and Family Services. There is no Children's Aid Society for Black families and community. We can, again, second half. However, all of them still operate under the same laws. They're all supposed to follow the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies standards and regulations. And so that has its own implications on if it is a progressive approach to have a community-specific CAS. So the rights of children and youth, and this is coming from the Act itself. Again, it's a summary. If you want more information, the Know Your Rights document will have more information. These are just some that I pulled. So, and this was kind of a part of the big overhaul of this right here, which is the right to be heard in all decisions made about the services they're receiving, to be informed about all decisions being made. Again, second half, we'll talk about it. You know, so that children and youth have a right to services that are relevant to them, meaning that it takes into account their race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, their class, all these kinds of things, the languages they speak, all of these things are meant to be taken in consideration, and children and youth have a right that happen and the services be relevant to them. You know, there are specific rights when children and youth are placed in child welfare. So in interim or extended care, and I'll talk about what those are. Children and youth have certain rights during child protection proceedings, specific to legal representation. That's a formatting issue. So again, I will talk about those shortly. So this is not, I'm not listing off all of the rights. There will be a document for folks if they want to go, if they want to see what more rights children and youth have. So rights of parents, caregivers, and grandparents. Again, see document should you want more information. So parents, caregivers, and grandparents have a right to legal representation throughout the process. meaning you can have a lawyer, that doesn't mean that child protection and governments have to provide that for you. There are certain circumstances which exist in law where that can arise, where child protection workers should or do have to provide lawyers to the family. And that, again, is more explained in the document. I don't have time to go through that. You know, for the so another kind of right for caregivers and grandparents in some ways. So the person caring for children and youth 6 months prior to a court proceeding does have a right to make submissions and be heard in that court proceeding. And I believe, notice again, that is in the Know Your Rights document. And then the parents have a right to be heard and given notice related decisions affecting their interests, right? So parents have a right to express concerns about the process. Parents have a right to express their side of the story and not be disciplined out of that. We will have, there in the second half, we will talk about what that looks like. And then obligations of child protection workers. This largely does come out of both the Act, but also the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Society, so OACAS. OACAS sets certain standards and standardized documents that from there explains best practices or obligations for child protection workers. Not all of them are arguably considered a part of law, which is its own issue. But a part of law is that child protection workers do owe a duty of care to children and youth. However, child protection workers do not owe a duty of care to parents. It would be a long explanation. It's essentially, the courts have said that to owe a duty of care to parents would be contradictory in their eyes to owing a duty of care to children and youth when it comes to a child protection investigation. And so that just means certain things around being able to get damages if something happens as a parent. There's certain ways that you cannot get damages. So in terms of obligations, services are meant to build on family strengths. This is coming out of OACAS, that child protection workers are supposed to consider alternative dispute resolution and least intrusive means. This is both coming from OACAS and Bill 89. And child protection workers have an obligation to engage in anti-oppressive practice. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with that language, it comes out of social work / education around a practice of being attentive to how oppression and oppressive dynamics operate outside of our professions, inside of our professions, and how we as individuals interact and understand this social world in which we live. And so child protection workers are supposed to take into account such things as anti-Black racism and, for example, the history of Black families globally and locally here, and what that means when they evaluate Black families. And that comes out of the child protection standards as well. So when is a child and youth considered in need of protection? So there are certain areas within the law that say this is when the law considers that a child may need protection. So if a child or youth suffers or is at risk of suffering physical harm by the person that is looking over them, if a child or youth suffers or is at risk of suffering sexual abuse or exploitation by the person looking over them as a parent caregiver. This includes, it's the next one. If a child or youth requires medical treatment or care and a parent or caregiver is refusing to provide that, and the child or youth is not able to consent to that care on their own. If a child, why is it? I can't see all this slide. If a child or youth suffers emotional harm causing serious mental health issues and developmental issues, and there's a reason to believe that the harm is a result of the parent, guardian, or caregiver, or as a result of parental inaction. Again, this is all in the eyes of the law. If the parent or parents die and there's no plan of care for the child, if the child is younger than 12 and has killed or seriously injured another person or destroyed another person's property, and certain services or treatment are necessary to prevent a reoccurrence, and the child's parent or the person in charge does not provide treatment where the child is incapable of consenting. If the parent is no longer able to provide care and the parent voluntarily seeks services. In this aspect, if the child or youth is 12 years or older, there's certain kinds of consent that is required of the child or youth. if the child, or if the child is, or if the youth is 16 or 17 and one of the above circumstances exist, the 16 or 17-year-old can voluntarily consent to services. So the functions of the Children's Aid Society. So Children's Aid Societies, or CAS, investigates allegations or evidence that children may be in need of protection. They protect where necessary. They provide guidance, counseling, and other services to families for protecting or for the prevention of requiring protection services. They provide care for children assigned or committed to care. They supervise children assigned for supervision. They place children, sorry, I can't see all of the slide. They place children for adoption, and they perform any other duties given to it by the CFA under the Act. So in terms of legal representation, so this is kind of a breakdown a little bit more regarding the right to legal representation, as I thought this was important to explain. So a child, a youth, or parent and caregiver may have legal representation, as I said, at any point during a child protection proceeding. If a child does not have legal representation, the court will decide as practically possible and determine if legal representation is needed to protect the child's interest. The Know Your Rights document explains that a little bit more and why that is and how they make the determination. I should say that there were people when this law was being created that advocated for not a may, but a shall, that children and youth should always have legal representation, no matter the discretion of an individual, meaning a judge or justice of peace. Children and youth may get a lawyer through a children's lawyer or children's lawyer, or through Justice for Children and Youth, both who have a mandate to represent children and youth dealing with child protection. Next slide. So in terms of legal representation for parents and caregivers, it's suggested that if you were going through a child protection proceeding and you don't have the income to get a lawyer, that you first go to a legal aid clinic and see if, one, you would be eligible, and two, if they do take on child protection cases. If that's not the case, then you want to apply for a legal aid certificate, which is through the Legal Aid of Ontario. That essentially allows you to, if you are accepted, to get a lawyer in your area, in a specific kind of area, meaning like within your area geographically. If that's not the case, you do kind of want to exhaust all possibilities when it comes to being able to financially get yourself a lawyer. That might include having to budget and proving that you tried moving finances around. And then it might be the case from there that if that doesn't help, or it's not possible, that you then engage CAS requesting that they possibly cover the cost of a child protection worker. There are certain circumstances, as I said, I have a lawyer. There are certain circumstances where CAS does have to provide that. My suggestion also might be that you at least go to a space that might give summary advice regarding legal representation, or you might go to someone who has a free or consultation, or who you can pay for a consultation, who you can explain the situation, and they might be able to help you around navigating having CAS / the government pay for a lawyer. And then in terms of legal representation from BLAC, as I said earlier, BLAC does not do family law. However, BLAC can provide summary legal advice regarding complaint procedures, status reviews, while also giving referrals to child protection workers. And BLAC can also take on cases related to discrimination and anti-BLAC racism in terms of child welfare. So the steps of a child protection investigation, these are the usual steps of a child protection investigation. This is a family-based step. That there are different kinds of investigations. So if it's an issue related to an institution, or if it's a caregiver that's not in the home, so if it was a babysitter, different kinds of investigations happen. I'm focusing on the family-based one. And even the Navigating Child Protection document is focused on that. There is more information online about what institutional and community caregiver investigations look like. So the usual first step is a face-to-face contact with the child alleged to be the victim, and an interview using methods consistent with the child's developmental stage and ability to communicate. There are interviews of other children being cared for in the home based on, again, their developmental level. There's an interview of the child's caregiver that is not accused of abuse or neglect, if there is one. There's direct observation. Sorry, I can't. There is direct observation of the child's living situation, which, you know, if there's concerns about the child's living situation being hazardous, the entire home is inspected. And then there's an interview of a person alleged to abuse and or neglect. So notice a lot actually happens before someone, supposedly, as the steps have said by OECS, a lot actually happens before the person that is alleged. Then there's a direct observation with the interaction between child and parent and caregiver. Then there are interviews with witnesses in person or by the phone, COVID, by the phone. They then use what's called, and I'll explain later, the eligibility spectrum to see who else may be at risk in terms of siblings. They interview all other adults living in the home, if there are those. They gather evidence from other professionals involved with the child and or family, such as doctors, if there's counseling services. They might even include like after school activities and speaking to people who run those. And there is, so then there's consideration about the need to seek a warrant for access to records. If someone is refusing a certain access as a parent or caregiver, they can actually they can go seek a warrant to get access to that information. So things to know, an investigation shouldn't be any longer than 60 days maximum. The plan of care, which is the whole plan around what they're going to do to deal with the supposed neglect and abuse, should be completed within 30 days of coming to a decision about the case. Something to know is that child protection workers actually have a lot of discretion. And what that means is they have a lot of discretion around what they consider evidence, despite the fact that it says that they're supposed to take everything into account. They get to decide what is considered reliable and creditable evidence. The style of investigation, there are kind of two styles. The one is the traditional one that I kind of just listed off. And then there is the customized kind of collaborative approach where they're supposed to engage the family a little bit more. They get to decide what style of investigation they pick based on the referral that they get and if they consider the referral severe. The tools, they also have a lot of discretion around if they consider something a safety or risk issue, if they consider something abuse and neglect, despite the standardized document. Something else to know is that, and I say that around the discretion is because often people may ask certain questions of the child protection worker, and the child protection worker will pretend like they don't have this power, and they do. And sometimes if you're experiencing that, you may want to speak to the supervisor, or again, hopefully you've engaged the representation for support. So another thing to know, in terms of the best interest of the child, by law, that actually includes an understanding and inclusion of the parent relationship and interest, right? Because apprehending a child is seen as the most invasive, is the most invasive measure on a parent's rights of security and being able to raise their child. And so while they don't owe a duty of care to parents, the duty of care that they owe children and youth include, and in the best interest of children and youth, includes hearing parents out, engaging parents in a meaningful and genuine way. Another thing to know is that, again, the least intrusive means is dependent on the assessed level of immediate risk. And then in terms, another thing to know is that with interviews with CAS, if you do not feel that you want to go through the interview as of yet because you feel unprepared, you don't know what to say, you don't know what they're going to ask you, you can actually say, I'm not going to do this interview as of yet until you get legal representation. So as I said, I wanted to talk about the life of a case. Of a child protection case. So that begins with an intake, whether that comes through referral or voluntarily from a family, whether that's the child, the youth, or the parents. Then they plan what the investigation is going to look like, meaning what style are they going to use based on the information they're given, who are they going to talk to, what kind of evidence might they want to look for, and then they are supposed to conduct the investigation. That's important to know because this is supposed to be a freestyle remix. Oh, maybe I'll go here, maybe I'll go there. Obviously, the investigation will kind of shift as they get more information, but there is supposed to be a plan in place and as to how they're going to do that. They then conduct what's called a safety assessment. I'll talk about what that is shortly, and they develop a safety plan. They also conduct a risk assessment. Again, I'll talk about that shortly. Through all of that, there are 3 key decisions that are made. One being verification. So verified, not verified, or inconclusive. Verified meaning yes, maltreatment, abuse, neglect, or not verified. There can actually be multiple. So you can say not verified neglect, but verified physical abuse. Inconclusive just means that with what they got for evidence, they couldn't make a decision either way. So that's one key decision, or could end up being a list of key decisions. Another one is determination if the child is in need of protection. So for example, someone could say verify neglect. However, child is not in need of protection because currently the issue of neglect was resolved. Then there is the investigation disposition, meaning what services are to be provided, if any. Then, if required, there's ongoing service and case management. So for the first month, that often means a lot of close monitoring contact between the child protection worker and the family and children and youth. And then depending on how that first month goes and what the safety concerns and risk concerns from their eyes were, that will decide what the relationship looks like going forward. And then there's the closing of the case. And when a case is closed, there's certain kinds of reevaluation around safety and risk. So I also thought it was important to know how the tools that folks are being assessed by or used by child protection workers, again, made by OACAS. And actually, if you go into the documents, they're made by OACAS and they say they've spoken to certain people, but a lot of those people are people who work within Children's Aid Society. It's not, there wasn't necessarily a conversation with community around these assessment practices and tools. So I mentioned earlier the eligibility spectrum, which covers 12 different sections where a worker matches the referral to appropriate reason and then gives it a scale within each section, and depending on the severity and the type of service, that will decide the type of service. So for example, one example could be, it says, one of the section is on physical abuse and did it happen? If it did, the severity is dependent around like the amount of harm that was caused, what the parent says around the situation of physical harm, and that will decide the service that they say should be given. Then there's the Ontario Child Protection Standards, another tool that child protection workers are supposed to read, and that tells them how they're supposed to govern themselves during the life of a case. So it's from here that you see things around anti-oppressive practice. You see things around, engaging the family as much as possible, informing the family and children and youth. All of this is encompassed in the standards. So then there's the Ontario Child Protection Tools Manual. And so these are often what's being used in terms of deciding if there's been abuse, neglect as well, and risk and safety concerns. So the first one is a safety assessment. So that determines the level of immediate danger through only yes or no questions, or yes or no answers, and considers the seriousness of the harm and danger given the current information. Meaning it's not supposed to look, and I notice I've put it so many times, and concerned with present conditions. It is not supposed to be future oriented. So for example, and I'll use this I'm going to unpack this later. So an example of a safety concern could be the physical living conditions as hazardous and immediate, threatening to the health and safety of a child. So that would be the concern. And then the example that they're telling child protection workers to look for is, are there open windows that have missing or broken screens? And you just click yes. You are not supposed to put anything else. You're not supposed to give any context. The next thing is a risk assessment, so which is different than the safety assessment. This is concerned with future risk and assesses for two major areas of abuse and or neglect. It's based on a scale with 10 factors that get scored. It's similar, it sounds very similar to the eligibility spectrum. So an example is, you know, that would be the heading. The primary parent or caregiver has a past or current alcohol, drug, or substance abuse problem. Then in order to, and then when you score it on a scale of, when you score it, sometimes it'll say 1 or 2 or 3, you would still score this, that it says that it interferes with the parents, the parent or caregiver or family's functioning, evidenced by example through treatment received currently or in the past. So pay attention, it's saying past, seeking treatment in the past, and that impacting the family in some kind of way is considered a risk. So it's taking into account a long history here, and we can unpack that later. So then there's the family and child strength and needs assessment. So each parent and each child is supposed to be assessed for their strengths and their needs. It's graded on a scale of A to D. An example such as resource management and basic needs. And I'm using these examples because I want to unpack them later. So it considers it a strength. Parent or caregiver provides adequate housing, food, and clothing to meet basic needs. Obviously, so you would score this one. A would be considered a strength. D would be considered a need, right? And so this is an important, and the language says parent provides. And then the last one, which also I should have brought up in the life of the case, as reunification assessment tools, which would go along, not necessarily with the closing of a case, but where the goal is in reunification, where there's assessment, reassessment around safety and risk in order to reunify the family and plan out what that looks like. Again, just because the family is reunified doesn't mean that they necessarily close the case. So the possible decisions in child protection, there are many possible outcomes in a child protection proceeding. You know, a child protection worker actually can decide based on the evidence given that there are no safety and risk concerns. So for example, someone says, you know, this child was up in the streets doing this, that, and the other thing. Parents were looking after them. You know, child protection worker comes and the parent says, no, my child was at these programs. And that can be confirmed based on the evidence. Then on its face, it should, the investigation should stop there. The child protection worker can, even after, as I just said, they can end the investigation. Then other possible decisions are what's called a supervision order, where the child protection worker can allow parents and caregivers to keep the child in their care under certain conditions. I would argue even if the child is taken from the care, there are certain conditions still put on the family. These conditions can include having to attend certain kinds of counseling, not engaging in certain behaviors or activities, and or not having contact with certain individuals. Oh. There should be more slides. What's the next one? Well, I guess I'm missing a slide and I will freestyle. So the next possible decision is temporary care. And so when it comes to temporary care, that is not supposed to be for a period of time longer than 12 months. And that can be with in out of home care with family or community members, depending on the situation, or that can be an interim society care. And interim society care is supposed to be for a period of no longer than 12 months. Another possible decision is extended care. And so that would be until an order is given to otherwise, you know, place the child back in the home. So there isn't a time restriction. And that would be in the care of a society. And so reviews and complaints. So a society can apply at any time to have the status of the case review. At that time, notice is supposed to be given to all parties. So children and youth who are 12 years of age and older are supposed to be given notice unless the court deems it as emotionally disruptive to the child or youth. I believe children 12 and under may be informed. 11 and under may be informed. Children at least 12 years of age can request a review. Usually when a decision is given, it will include a period of time in which parents and caregivers can request a review. After that time, a review of a decision they cannot request one for the first 6 months. A review cannot be made if a child is placed under adoption. And I don't know, so many things. And so that's in terms of like going to a court or what have you, but internally within CAS, there are supposed to be, one, arguably the child protection worker is supposed to be constantly monitoring the life of the case and making their own kinds of assessment, but supervisors and directors are supposed to be reviewing at least annually the status of a case, if not every 6 months. It just depends at the time that the case comes to the Children's Aid Society. And both within internally, like you can have a decision appealed and you go to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. So complaints. So if you are someone, both a child, youth, family, caregiver, you are supposed to follow the internal. You are supposed to follow the internal procedures. That is, they are supposed to have been given both to children and youth when they are placed, where they are placed, and they're also supposed to be given to the parents and caregivers. But also that information should be publicly accessible on the society's website. So you are supposed to go through the review internally. And so after that, if you disagree with the finding, you can then go to the board. There are also certain matters that you can bring to the board immediately without going to the director or following those procedures. That doesn't mean that the society then won't do their own internal review. And I believe that these are also the matters that can only come before a board. So if a society refused to proceed with the complaint, if the society has failed to respond to the complaint within the time frame required by regulation, if the society has failed to comply with the complaint review procedure or other procedural requirements related to the review complaint, if the society has failed to comply with children and parents having a right to and an opportunity to be heard and represented when decisions affect their interests are made, and to be heard when they have concerns about the service they receive. Other matters such as society has failed to provide reasons for a decision that affects the complainant's interests, and other prescribed matters such as if laws change or if within the society they deem it, or the board. So that ends the first half. Are there questions specific to this kind of information?
Hi, Josh. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa.
Doing great. Okay, so there were a couple of questions. The first question that somebody asked was, this person struggles with the fact that CAS in Windsor, Essex, will provide financial assistance for children in care to strangers, but not provide financial assistance when children are in care with relatives. This is disadvantageous and discriminatory. When will this be corrected? Do we have any idea about that?
I haven't seen any. I mean, we know our current government, not only do they not care about a substantive welfare state, they especially don't care about it when they know it impacts certain populations. I know there have been continuous calls to address this disparity. And I believe that those calls, and honestly, it's not just the Ford government. We have to remember that there was a liberal Wynne government before this that made this possible, right? So, yeah, I don't know if we'll see an end to this kind of practice where money's being funneled into the pockets of, child welfare and then foster parents, group homes, and not the kinship care.
Right. I believe this is right across Ontario. It's not just Windsor.
Yeah. So it is that. Yeah. So that's why I didn't say Windsor, Essex. Like it isn't. It's thing across Ontario.
Okay. Another question here is, so if a case is open on a family, even if it's decided based on the evidence that there's no concern, is this permanently on record for the for the caregiver and child?
It is. And so I will be talking about later around CAS as branding Black families. But the moment any information is received, there is a kind of file that follows that family, like for life. And so even a referral about a family, like even a referral that leads nowhere, and if the case is closed, that referral in itself is still taken into account in the future. Now, I should say, when it comes to court proceedings, if a child protection worker in CAS has made really egregious decisions, courts might say you weren't really supposed to take this kind of information into account, but that information is still there, and it's still a very subjective practice.
Okay, so thanks for that. That seems to be all the questions that I see for now. Okay. If there's other questions, people can feel free to post them in the Q&A section.
Okay, look at us, we're making good time. Okay, here we go, folks. So part 2. Hopefully all of my slides are here. I don't know what happened. So this next part is kind of the critical take. Now I want to be very clear. The law has maybe one understanding of what anti-Black racism is, if it wants to understand it at all. We collectively as Black people, not all share the same understanding, but we collectively as Black people might have a deeper, thicker, more nuanced understanding of what anti-Black racism is and how it affects our lives. And so as I go through this next part, and I actually should have said earlier, none of this presentation is legal advice, so please do not cite this as legal advice. If you're looking for legal advice, go seek legal representation for that. This is just legal information. But in terms of this next half, this information is not considered law. This information is often taking different areas of conversations around Black life and child welfare or otherwise and bringing them together. That way we can understand all of this. Again, as I'm speaking, if you have questions about things that I'm saying, like what do you mean about this? What is this? By all means, ask questions. If you want to know my opinion on certain things, I might give it, I might not. Just depends. And I say that just because I think there's some opinions that maybe I don't know if they need to be given anymore. So this is the second half. Don't try to use this now to argue anti-Black racism in a court in certain ways. Well, obviously, I wish that you could, but here we are. So I wanted to start to make sure that within this second half, that the listeners or viewers, because you can see me, that we share some kind of common understanding, at least within the confines of this webinar. You might not agree with everything that I'm saying. That's great. These are the definitions and words that I'm using. These are the connections that I'm going to make. Both as a Black child welfare survivor, as a Black organizer, activist, scholar, law student, social work, formerly or currently in some ways. So I am blending all of this stuff together. And so I'm trying to at least make sure we share this collective understanding. There's just other words that I might not pull in or theorizing that I won't pull in. That's just because of the limitations of the time we have here today. So anti-Black racism is defined as policies and practices embedded within Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in the unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization in Canada. And so when we think of this term, we shouldn't be citing the Stephen Lewis report as the person who birthed this term. Anti-Black racism, as we were talking about it here in Canada and in Toronto, came out of Black organizing communities and then, hit the waves when Dr. Pula Benjamin publicly said the word and took the risk of doing so. And I say risk because naming our realities often makes us unsafe. And a term such as anti-Black racism very clearly indicates that Black people have a separate and distinct experience from Indigenous peoples to Turtle Island and racialized people, hence it being a risk. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit in certain ways, as I think it'll be relevant to this webinar. Again, I'm not going to give folks a lecture on on anti-Black racism in a certain kind of way, because it could just go on and on. There's many thinkers who've tried to think of the conditions of Black life. And in some ways I'm going to unpack terms if I disagree with them. But so in terms of so anti-Black racism includes overt and covert anti-Black racism. Overt meaning the things, you know, often people cite using the N-word. I would argue that even then that continues to be contentious. As a law student, for some reason, I was having to disagree with other law students, including Black students, with white law students saying the N-word, right? So it's, I say there's disagreement, so we consider it overt, but, you know, we're still here. Then there's covert anti-Black racism, which is supposed to, often the terms are microaggression, and, you know, it's subtle, and you can't really tell, and it takes you a little while to figure out. My content, I'm putting it here because I know that there's these words in collective understanding. I think that for Black folks, and especially as Black folks, as we politicize ourselves and read and listen and engage one another and community organize, the overt and covert kind of just disappear, and it's anti-Black racism, and we feel the violence of it, and it's leveled and deep. Obviously, there's always those kinds of experiences where you're kind of like, what just happened? And it takes a second to figure out. But I think often covert racism, you know, is what we call Canada's like the covert racist, and I disagree with that. So, you know, that I think that's an important thing to hold. Then there's the intentional and unintentional anti-Black racism, the person who intends to say it, the person who did, I didn't mean it. Both are still anti-Black racism, and I would argue in a society which, especially in Canada, where we pretend that Black people aren't here all the time, and that Black people are new to our arrival to Canada, as Dr. Ronaldo Walcott says, I don't know if it's unintentional that people don't know to say and do particular things, because I would argue this is a systemic setup for people to engage in these behaviors and practices and build these anti-Black white supremacist institutions. So anti-Black racism, from this definition, if we're talking about the unique history and experience of enslavement, is an ongoing history. There isn't slavery and enslavement over there and our current times. It is all one timeline, and certain enslaving continuities continue to exist. They just reshape and reform, and I plan on doing that with child welfare. As I kind of just mentioned, a big part, especially here in Canada, is that that Black people are always erased, that our calls for liberation and a better life beyond these conditions are always treated as brand new. Everyone's acting shocked, whether it's your university, whether it's your employer, whether it's your best friend. Everyone's shocked and appalled, as if though this hasn't been going on for centuries, including here. This erasure includes the particular reality here in Canada, where, well, there wasn't plantation slavery. In some ways, I think that can also be challenged, but also the way in which slavery looked here in Canada had a certain form of violence for Black folks. A big part of anti-Black racism is carcerality, meaning, you know, the over and hyper surveillance of Black people, of Black communities. You know, Doug Ford is spending money on putting cameras and surveilling the Jane and Finch community, and there's, you know, there's folks doing work around that. You know, the over and hyper surveillance of the ways in which Black folks seek support from one another and from the system. Criminalizing Black folks, whether engaging in behaviors or conduct that the system considers criminal or not, being criminalized through certain language, through certain statuses that again pull you into being further surveilled. That this includes a process of demonizing Black folks. So when we push back and try to resist or name our realities, often speaking about us in certain ways, or angry, aggressive, violent. Christina Sharp, I believe Dr. Christina Sharp calls it monstrous bodies. You know, so we're monstrous beings. Obviously, carcerality includes incarceration. And so we're talking about the prison industrial complex, but we are also talking about how, you know, that carcerality and that in carceral experience is in not just prisons, but also the mental health industrial complex. And so we're looking at the psychiatric system. We're talking about child welfare. we're talking about, when we're talking about carcerality, especially when it comes to confinement, we're talking about how people are unable to live unencumbered by constant surveillance. And so we are also talking about our workplaces. We're also talking about our professions, and I will be talking about that later. A big part of anti-Black racism is disbelievability. So whenever a part of the shock and appall is then requiring people to have to evidence and over-evidence our Black realities. I didn't mention it earlier, but with the shooting of Jacob Blake, with the findings with Regis Korchinski-Paquette, you know, we continue to have to circulate through these conversations as if though we haven't been trying to deal with these realities for decades. And it seems to be every time there's a new death or a new deathly experience, people are acting shocked because they disbelieve that the system intends to function this way and position Black people in these ways. A big part of anti-Black racism and you know, and its relationship to colonialism is dispossession and displacement, moving Black people around. You know, when I was listening to Adil Abdullahi and Al Jones in their No Life Left Behind, talking about folks who are incarcerated for life, you know, they talk about, you know, people just being moved around by the whim of the system, and Black people in particular for certain reasons. You know, child welfare, I'm going to get into dispossession and displacement. But it's also dispossession, displacement because of how these, in a global perspective, how Black folks are trying to flee to find some kind of livability, and the ways in which colonialism continue to impact their homes, to have to move to spaces such as Europe, to have to move to spaces such as Canada or the Americas, you know? So this is also part of displacement and dispossession. A big part of anti-Black racism is that they interlock and formulate other systems of oppression, right? So sexism, cis-heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, which is distinct from anti-Black racism, ableism, other forms of oppression are formulated by anti-Black racism, connect with anti-Black racism, and look a particular way. And I do try to kind of pull that in to view throughout this second half. So I thought it was integral that people know this term because, at least for my own work and my research, you know, when we talk about child welfare and we're talking about Black families, we are talking about the particular harassment and assault on Black women. And so Misogynoir describes how racism and anti-Blackness alter the experience of misogyny for Black women. Specifically, it alludes to specifically Black women's experiences with gender and how both racism and anti-Blackness alter that experience diametrically from both white women and differently from non-Black women of color. And so this was coined by Moya Bailey and Trudy, I believe back in 2013 and 2014. Trudy has certain requirements for citing her, so I didn't cite more. But essentially, misogynoir includes controlling images or what we call stereotypes, such as the welfare queen, such as the angry Black woman, such as the Jezebel, the Black woman who is hypersexualized and hypersexual and can never be contained, can never contain her sexuality. And so there were certain ways in which this justified violence towards, sexual violence towards Black women, and continues to justify sexual violence towards Black women and femme folks. Such as the matriarch, meaning that the Black woman is infantilizing, not infantilizing, that the Black woman in the home is demasculating the Black man, or that there must be a Black man that is dominant in the home. And so that's seen to have a negative impact on the family. And so misogynoir does, especially when we're talking about child welfare and when we're talking about, you know, child welfare and social work, and the welfare system being largely run by white women or women, it's important that we have this language. And the next term is anti-Black Satanism, coined by Assistant Professor Adil Abdullahi, and it describes the deathly reality of Black people when it comes to mental health issues and experiences of mental health institutions, systems, and discourse. As described by her in her book, Black and Badness, Anti-Blackness, Medicalization, and Everyday Black Life in Canada, which is coming out this year. You know, she says it refers to when the suffering of anti-Black racism in psychiatry are compounded, and that we need to understand that this is a form of discrimination under the Ontario Human Rights Code, and we're talking about disability. So this, we're not just, we should understand this within the scope of the legal system. And there are two key terms that, for me, both in my research and the work that I do around child welfare survivorship, that I found were really helpful in understanding my reality and the realities of Black families, which is Black psychiatrized mad, which refers to the Black person who's forced in relationship to the psychiatric system. This often looks like being over and misdiagnosed and over medicated. And so use what's called kind of chemical incarceration, punitive and deathly responses, always and forever towards folks who are understood as mad, Black and mad because of the psychiatric system. And, you know, an important thing that I have found from reading and listening to Assistant Professor Dil Abdullahi's work is that the ways in which care, especially for Black people, is always carceral for Black people. And so when we call for better care, she's demanding that when we call for better care, that we have to remember to dismantle care and carcerality, that care for Black people has always included carcerality, and we're going to get into that later when it comes to child welfare. Second term is maddened Blackness, which is different from the Black psychiatrized mad person. And maddened Blackness, or blackened madness, is the process of always seeing Blackness as mad, that Black people are always crazy to the non-Black person. So for example, when we name a reality, we are often talked about like we don't know what we're talking about. When we name a reality, we are often we are called crazy. We're also called things such as terrorists. And I think there's a relationship then to, you know, Black Muslim folks and anti-Black Islamophobia, you know, and a part of the Black and madness experience is that we are also navigating a white supremacist anti-Black world, which is in fact maddening. And a part of the Black and madness experience is not being able to name it as such, and not being able to experience it as such. And should we do one or both of those things, we then experience certain kind of carceral conditions put upon us. So lastly, in terms of colonialism, and when we talk about child protection, that we have an understanding of colonialism. So the violence, so is the violent process of taking control over the space or place of another people's, and then I would argue the attempting to take over the interiority of a people as to how they think and function about themselves and their communities. Not just me argue, many people would argue. This includes the degradation and theft of land, plants, and animals in order to make these spaces unlivable for the original peoples of those lands, as well as often for the economic benefit of the colonizing groups. Through colonialism, acts of genocide and dehumanization are justified under economic and civilization discourses. Settler colonialism refers to the colonizers actively inhabiting and stealing land and resources for their own migration. So again, a part of colonialism is forced migration. This includes the transatlantic slave trade, but also includes the reality of many people, but including Black people, having to flee the lands in which they currently live on because of how colonialism and imperialism continue to impact their lives. This includes stealing people from their land and resources, as I said earlier. It's creating certain deathly conditions for those being colonized. So we are talking about, for example, lack of access to drinking water in Indigenous communities here, but we're also talking about the lack of safe drinking water in areas where there's often social housing. The buildings are made unsafe. We're talking about spaces such as Michigan, right? These are acts of colonialism in order to try to create deathly conditions for Black people. We're talking about carceral conditions as acts of colonialism by trying to contain people. We are talking about policing and police as actors of colonialism, and that includes child welfare. And from there, you can look at like such things as social determinants of health, socioeconomic status. All of those really indicate the deathly conditions in which colonized peoples are forced under and trying to survive and push back against. And this includes attempts at removing the original people's forms of governance and ways of living while imposing imperialism, colonized forms of governance and modalities of life and living. And then that gets to decide what and who is considered human. So those are key terms. Now we're going to take those and apply those to the reality of Black families. And so we're going to look at the history of Black families from slavery to now. I am not doing a comprehensive, take up every author's take on the history of Black families. That's not my goal here. I'm trying to get things in a general sense to have people think, talk, ask questions, and practice and organize differently. So when we look at Black families from slavery, so it is from slavery to now. I'm not talking about what Black families looked like before slavery. I think there's important space for that when we think about decolonization, but I'm starting the timeline as of slavery. And so with slavery, enslaved Black people were considered as property, which meant Black parents were not seen as parents and Black children were not seen as children. What this means is the anti-Black white supremacist construction of who is parent and child has always excluded Blackness and Black people, right, to this day, and we will see what that looks like. But it's important that we understand that just because we started using the language of Black parents and Black children doesn't mean Black parents and Black children get to experience parenthood or childhood in that way. Black parents and children were commodified, so they were units, they were property and units of labor, and therefore were through that they experienced extreme forms of violence, children and youth, and parents. This included a legal fracturing of Black families, right? So this is where when Black women or folks who would give birth, they would have their children taken from them immediately or at any point in time. Often, actually, white slave owners would take and remove children and move families around. And when I say move, sell. And this was an act of expressing power to show that at any point in time, not only do white slave owners have control over birth, but they also have control over the life of the people that they are enslaving. This includes, and leading up to what we call necropolitics, which is also the power to control the deaths of people, right? So by causing so much violence and harm and overworking Black children and youth as well, Black children and youth would die, right? Or Black babies would die due to malnourishment. So this is all a part of as we talk about fracturing Black families, this is a part of it. In terms of fracturing, this includes, the taking of Black children and youth from their parents, and they would go on different slave ships and be put on different, they were put in place, and forcibly so, on different slave ships. And so the fracturing began there. The fracturing began before that, arguably, as well, before Black folks were taken from the continent. I do think, so recently, again, when I was listening to or watching Adil Abdullahi and Al Jones with their series called No Life Left Behind, they were talking about, however, that we always have to think about what was livability under these conditions, not to justify or romanticize these conditions, but more so to understand that a part of livability as Black folks, the fact that we continue to live, shows that there were acts of resistance. And so Black parents and mothers would still parent and raise as much as they could. They would still provide care. The practice of other mothering comes out of the reality that Black women and femme folks would still try to, even if it wasn't their own child, still try to provide care to the children and youth who are around them. There was a resistance to necropolitics, and this does this does come from Simone Brown talks about this in her book Dark Matters. there were parents and mothers who would try to find ways, obviously would have an impact on their health, to abort, or they would jump from the slave ships with their children and youth, or sometimes if they could at least, you know, throw the child or youth overboard. And that might be a hard thing to hear, but it was a resistance to the reality that these parents did not want their children to suffer under enslavement and did not want these white slave owners to have this level of control over the lives of their children and youth. So that's slavery. So we're making jumps. So now we have all of that period, and then we go to supposed emancipation, or you know, with Dr. Ronaldo Walcott's new book, The Long Emancipation, coming soon in 2021. As we've gone through this long emancipatory period, that there's still yet to be freedom and liberation. There was the exclusion of Black people from socioeconomic growth. So we're talking about education, we're talking about employment. And the Black folks were relegated to specific jobs that didn't pay well. They weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And so, you know, we're talking about segregation, we're talking about certain standards and practices, and being refused to be allowed to become, you know, professions such as lawyers, doctors, so on and so forth. All of this actually has a relationship to the development of the child welfare system or the welfare state, because with the welfare state, as people are being relegated to lower socioeconomic status, and you're developing a welfare state that is supposed to alleviate these issues, this same welfare state was still exclusionary based on race. So Black folks still couldn't seek support. If they were, it was minimal. And so this is a part of the trajectory that when we talk about Black families. So then we have the development of certain institutions, professions, and practices. So we're talking about what we call now interior works. We're talking about, you know, employment insurance. We're talking about, and we're talking about child welfare, as I put there. But we're also talking about the people who run these institutions, who start to become white women. And so we see the development of practices such as social work, child and youth care. And these were fields created by and for white women, largely to, frankly, have a piece of the white supremacist pie and get to deploy the white supremacist anti-Black power, while still, of course, you know, maybe experiencing patriarchy and sexism, of course, but yet and still they were willing to engage in this kind of systemic oppression. And so you see the development of social work, which in itself is a ethically bankrupt and very dangerous and harming field. You then also have child welfare development. And while folks talk about, as in some ways I was taught often by white women in social work, that child welfare began with when they were trying to find ways to support the I believe it was from Britain, children who were coming from Britain, who were brought across to do manual labor, and then they were living in the streets and they were trying to provide supports. Yeah, that can be your point of entry. Or if you actually look at a long history, which is for Black and Indigenous people, the practice of child welfare actually began with what I was describing, which is the colonization and enslavement of Black and Indigenous peoples and the fracturing of their families and relegating them in certain places, right? The practice of placement began there. It actually, I would argue, it did not begin with the white kids. And you see the development of child welfare from that. And, you know, and under that child welfare umbrella, you see residential schooling, you see the 60 scoop, the millennial scoop, you see, I believe out east, there was the home for colored children, and that was largely for Black kids. So you see these institutions develop. They are white supremacists, they're anti-Black, they have these long histories. You also see a particular kind of certain kinds of anti-Black constructions of the Black family here in Canada. So despite the domestic worker scheme that brought a lot of Black women from the Caribbean across to work in the homes of white families, largely caring for white children, at the same time, you had this anti-Black construction of Black mothers not being able to parent or not being good parents, right? And so when we talk about anti-Black racism, a big part of anti-Black racism is the cognitive dissonance, where you say one thing, but there's this other reality that would challenge you. And so we see with the domestic worker scheme, And we also have to acknowledge that as Black women were coming across in this scheme, the reality, the dangerous realities these Black women were put in. And so, you know, from that scheme, we see staggered migration. And so in the 1990s, when we talk about the welfare queen, we, especially in Canada, we actually don't, a lot of folks don't start from the appropriate place, I would say, which is when some Somali women were coming across were fleeing to Canada as refugees in the 1990s, and the issue of staggered migration, these Somali women were married, and they were saying they're still married, but they didn't have the partners with them because of staggered migration. And so then there was this government policy backlash saying, well, you're trying to steal money. You're saying you're married. You're actually sending this money across. You see this. You also see this this anti-Black Islamophobia take part there, and talking about you're sending this money back to terrorists. And so you see also with the construction of the Black family, you see that for Black Muslim women, there was a particular way in which Black Muslim women were talked about. And that's an important reality that we need to acknowledge when we talk about the construction of the Black family. At that same time, again, both because of the domestic worker scheme, because of the migration of certain people coming across as refugees as well, you see Misogynoir play out around how single Black mothers were talked about. And so, you know, looping back to what I was talking about with around the matriarch, you know, oh, there's no Black father in the home, so this is a risk, this is a safety, oh, you're not a good mother, where's your man? Or on the flip side, should you be someone who's trying to engage social assistance, whether that be through OW or whether that actually be the child welfare system, oh, you have a man in your home, and the hypersexualization and then therefore demonization of Black women's sexuality as welfare queens, quote unquote. And you also see at this same time, and then there always has been, you know, through the long emancipation that we were experiencing, the criminalization of youth in particular ways. But in the 1980s, 1990s, as we progress to now, the criminalization of Black youth and Black childhood. And so we see moments such as the Just Desserts, where folks can look that up. I don't really have the time to explain all of it, but you see a moment where two Black youth are implicated in crime or commit a crime, and the following discourse around, you know, not only Jamaican communities, but about Black parents and Black youth, right? So Black parents are then being vilified and demonized because supposedly from the white supremacist anti-Black view, these Black families can't parent their kids properly. You know, absenteeism from education is pulled into there, absenteeism, and, you know, oh, these parents aren't sure, and often, you know, these Black mothers, these Black women aren't ensuring their kids are coming to school. So all of this actually participates in the anti-Black construction of the Black family. Now, there are other ways in which there's anti-Black constructions of the Black family. These are the key ones that I'm highlighting. Of course, there are more. Again, when we're talking about the history of Black families from slavery to now, we're also talking about, when we're talking about the development of the welfare state, what neoliberalism does to the welfare state, particularly in the late 1980s to the 1990s to now. And so when we're talking about neoliberalism, neoliberalism refers to moving from a collective model of supporting and understanding people to very individualized, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be financially independent, or if you are having issues, your family should support you. The last means of support should come from the government. If you go to the government for support, we are going to surveil you. The supports that we give you are not meant to help you live your life. In fact, we are going to give you such minimal supports that you can barely live off of them, and that is seen as a motivator for you to not be on them. And so there's a lot of penalization of being on social assistance, both publicly. Again, that comes to the discourse of you know, welfare queens, and that comes to the discourse of of how Black mothers are talked about. Another big part of neoliberalism then is also the shift to saving money for the government. And so we see tools around making it efficient to do our practices. And this is both in social work, and specifically in areas such as social assistance, ODSP, and child welfare. And arguably, neoliberalism is a problem across many professions. And so by trying to save money, neoliberalism creates a set of tools that is supposed to be standardized to make it faster and easier. And at the same time, these tools are called best practice tools, evidence-based tools, and all of that can be deconstructed. Who were your subjects? Who did you talk about? Who did you talk to? Is this evident? What was your evidence? Is this best practice? Best practice for who, right? All of this carves out the welfare state. So supports become minimal. People are being penalized and pushed out. And this is all happening, again, at the same time that Black families continue to be relegated to lower socioeconomic status. Now, one of the things that I do want to loop back to is when I mentioned the home for colored children, it was only for Black children, and it was rampant with sexual abuse, right? So we have to acknowledge that. And I believe that was, when we talk about recent history, that was closed still within recent history. So we have now, hopefully, and to be clear, it closed in 1995. So I was 1 year old. I mean, now I've exposed my whatever. I was 1 year old when that happened, 1996. So now we have this history. Again, there's many ways that we can complicate this history. There's many ways we could talk about this history. I don't have that kind of time. So there are key reports when it comes to child welfare and anti-Black racism. A lot of them are being cited recently. I want to be very clear. Some of these organizations that have done these reports have also been implicated in anti-Black racism towards specifically child Black welfare survivors. So I'm talking about, and their staff. So I am talking about the Office of Ontario Child Advocate. I am also talking about crossover youth, right? And if you're asking, you know, what do you mean? Some of that is publicly accessible and apparent. So and a lot of these reports focus on the issue of disproportionality and overrepresentation. However, a lot of reports, and I was trying to see if they are publicly accessible. I'm not quite sure. I thought they were supposed, since they've closed down, they were supposed to be archiving it somewhere. But a report from 1998 was looking more broadly at the experiences of child welfare survivors, what's happening. I say child welfare survivors, I don't say youth in care. I don't use that care language because I think it erases the carceral experience, and I think it participates in the benevolent idea of not only social work, but child welfare and then Canada. But this 1998 report, this office never did race-based statistics when conducting the reports. But they did identify, a racialized youth, and when you read the narrative, it's a Black young person. They were talking about experiences of violence and abuse. They were talking about experience of policing. They were talking about the very desperate socioeconomic outcomes of child welfare survivors. You know, I remember at the time when I was reading a report in 2012 or 2014, like child welfare survivors in general have a high school graduation rate of, it was like 48% in comparison to something like at that time, maybe 86 or 87% of the general population. So you compound that with being Black in child welfare. And ask yourself certain questions, and I might provide certain answers. So there have been a lot of reports, at least since 1998, talking about, whether naming it or not, anti-Black racism, talking about the disaster that is child welfare. We then have the One Vision, One Voice report called Changing the Ontario Child Welfare System to Better Serve African Canadians. It does name anti-Black racism. It does name the colonial nature of child welfare. It does also name, you know, certain experiences from parents, youth, so on and so forth. And so that is another report. It is publicly accessible. And in that report, they talk about, you know, what anti-Black racism looked like, and you know, in terms of the harm, how Black parents were understood, so on and so forth. We also had the Ontario Human Rights Commission that also in 2016 or 2017 released the report Interrupted Childhoods, Overrepresentation of Indigenous and Children and Youth, Indigenous and Black children in Ontario child welfare. This, again, was very honed in on the issue. We also have the crossover youth report, Navigating Quicksand. It looks particularly at the relationship between youth criminal justice, and child welfare, and trying to manage and deal with that. Overall, though, for myself, so as I said, I've done my own research. It is supposed to be published at some point in the near future. Issues of disproportionality and overrepresentation are only one part of the issue that is child welfare for Black families. However, I kept finding that everyone wants to talk about overrepresentation and disproportionality. And what that wasn't doing was talking about the experiences of no one was contouring what anti-Black racism looked like for Black parents, what it looked like for Black child welfare survivors. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of these are, at least, for the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and including the One Vision, One Voice, and even some of the Ontario Child Advocates reports, still end up disappearing Black child welfare survivors. And so no one was really, for me, talking about these experiences. Maybe Crossover Youth did that a little bit. Frankly, Crossover Youth ended up participating in that very dynamic they say they were naming. So there it is. And so what I do, at least with the next part of this, this webinar, is I'm trying to contour for you what this all looks like. Again, the law might not agree with me. Frankly, I very rarely agree with the law. So we're gonna go to the next slide. So anti-Black racism for parents and caregivers. First, we need to acknowledge the role of the social worker. And as I said, the social work profession was made for and by white women. It is very much ingrained and embedded and rooted in colonialism and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous understandings. It is very cis heteronormative as a profession, as much as it wants to parade, a rainbow flag and a Black power fist. It is still that kind of profession. And so, but within this child protection issue, social workers are really acting firstly as investigator, or I would argue as police and policing. Their badge just looks different, but they're also acting as jury and judge. So earlier I had said that that social workers are making determinations about what is considered evidence. And for me, especially as a law student, but also for me as someone with a BSW and MSW, I know that when I went through my BSW and MSW, I was never taught how to consider something evidence on a balance of probabilities. I might have talked about it because of certain professors who taught me, but in general, the curriculum is not teaching social workers how to understand evidence. What is evidence? How do you try to be unbiased while considering evidence? And so this social worker, this child protection worker, who is often white, or even if the shade of the worker changes, still embedded in this white supremacist anti-Black profession, subjectively is making determinations not only about evidence, but if, as they hear evidence, what that means for, are they gonna click yes or no? And so, for example, when I was talking about the thing in relation to the screen, right? Where if you come in, it's considered a hazardous if the window doesn't have a screen. I personally would ask, maybe why isn't there a screen? And they might tell me, well, I've tried to engage the property manager, they're not fixing it. Or they might tell me certain concerns about having to engage that property manager. I might not find that I would not necessarily consider someone neglectful if in fact they tried to take means, or there's a context as to the reason why they haven't taken means, real concerns about their safety. This child protection tool does not take into account of that. And the neoliberal, the child protection worker, the one who follows the rules, is just gonna click, yep, they are neglectful, or yes, they are hazardous, and that is gonna be a score against this parent. There are also, there's rhetoric around, in some ways rightfully so, trying to keep these cases outside of the court and trying to manage them outside of the court. But what that also means is that there's a lot of power and discretion in the hands of child protection workers and their supervisors, where the supervision orders that they're making and the conditions that they're putting parents under, they get to make those kind of determinations. Where children and youth are being placed, all of these things are happening outside of a court. And so we have to understand that in many ways, actually a social worker under child protection, because of the supposed benevolence of child welfare and social workers and they must have big hearts, there's been a lot of power afforded to child protection workers. And I would argue in some ways, maybe possibly differently more so than police officers themselves, right? That anything could be considered evidence. And so, for example, in relation to Black parents and caregivers, and the work that I do with the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors, we intervene as advocates around cases. We had a child protection worker who verified neglect towards a Black mother, and I do have permission to talk about this publicly. They verified neglect. There was issues between her and the daycare because they were being antagonistic towards her. She was trying to address it. They call CAS. CAS comes. They you know, as a part of their step, interview the child, meaning they come see the child. There was a pair of shoes on the child, and then they determined that the shoes for the toddler, who at this time would have been 1 or 1.5, were too tight for the child's feet, and therefore neglect was verified. And when I asked certain questions around, so firstly, when the child protection worker saw the shoes, she had come to the daycare center, and then she had left, and then when the mother had come to pick up the child, the daycare center informed that they had called CAS because the mother was like, where are the shoes? The daycare workers then said, oh, the CAS worker took the shoes. The CAS worker never took the shoes. The shoes went missing for a period of 2 weeks. So when we're talking about the reliability of evidence, the shoes went missing for 2 weeks. The CAS worker had shown up at the Black mother's house, said, where are the shoes? Black mother says, they said, you have it. CS worker says, we don't have the power to take them in that way. But yet and still, they made this determination based on this now missing evidence. This evidence didn't come back into the hands of the Black mother until the CAS worker went to collect the things left at the daycare that were the child, and suddenly the shoes appear. And they also appear in very scuffed up state. And the Black mother tried to advocate for herself, saying, you know, this is not the state that the shoes were in when I had them, all of these things. So evidence has gone missing, evidence is returned, evidence possibly looks different than when it was. So when I'm sitting there and I'm saying, well, so what was the concern around neglect? How did you verify neglect based on the shoes? She said, well, I was concerned around the impact of the shoes on the child's development. So I asked her, well, did you go and speak to a doctor? She says, no. So, or about this issue. And so we see that this, in a certain way, the social worker is trying to act like a doctor. She's making developmental determinations that she frankly does not have. And I asked her, do you have the qualifications to make these determinations around, were you ever taught developmental stages? What can impact that? So on and so forth. She said no. And so very clearly, we see this all-encompassing power that is, and when I spoke to other child protection lawyers, they said child protection workers are given a lot of power. The role of the social workers to also be considered, and often, especially for Black families, they're often calling police, especially when, you know, the child protection worker is coming to a certain area. So they make the assumptions around their own safety and the safety of the child, and they bring police. The presence of police and the social worker in itself causes very real and reasonable upset for whoever's opening that door. So it's important to consider that as anti-Black racism for parents and caregivers. The role of the referral, meaning whether it's the school, the daycare, police themselves, the hospital, we have to complicate the duty to report as a form of indoctrinating policing into the minds of people. We are saying that you have a duty to report, no matter if you have the smallest suspicion. You're not even supposed to ask questions, right? And so we are telling people to police each other. I am not saying that we shouldn't be caring for one another. What I'm saying is I don't know if this duty report has led to anything other than policing both poor families and in particular Black and Indigenous families. And we see this, for example, with the case where in 2017, there was a news report about how a school called CAS on a Black family and a Black mother because she sent her kid to school with a roti, right? So we also see the link to fat oppression, right? So in a white family, maybe a kid is seen as big boned or healthy, or they walk in and because it's a white family and they maybe live in a particular home, hamburger helper and canned soup is all seen as having food, but they enter a Black home and hamburger helper and canned soup is seen as malnourishment. But also certain foods that come from our communities are seen as malnourished. So there is a link to fat oppression, and there is when it comes to the duty to report and seeing things around health or unhealthy. And as I mentioned, this is coming from daycare, schools, and hospitals. We can talk about the anti-Black racism within all of these institutions that then are compounded or participate in the anti-Black racism in child welfare. There's also, in terms of the duty to report and referral, and specifically around bodily autonomy and the autonomy to raise your children within the cultural context that you know in certain ways, that there have also been calls about kids having dreads and the referral saying, oh, this kid is unkempt, he's not bathed, his hair is disgusting, all this stuff. They're making all these kinds of assumptions, right? And so that's also a part of the considering anti-Black racism within the referral point. And speaking to child protection workers across class, there's this, and this is also in the One Vision, One Voice report, is across class, despite class, when child protection workers are involved with a Black family, there is still a consistent demonization of the Black parents. There is still disbelievability of Black parents, which I'm going to talk about next. And so we see across class, there is an overwillingness to police Black families and make certain severe determinations and then take severe approaches. And so that leads into disbelievability. Black parents and caregivers are often disbelieved when they try to speak to their context. There are also ways in which, as Black people, we speak different about our reality. And speaking to one Black child protection lawyer, she was saying how she had a client that because she said these kids are going to kill me, this ended up into a whole child investigation. Now, obviously, she meant these kids are exhausting in certain kinds of way, which is fair. Instead, this is turned into a full-blown investigation. And when someone comes to investigate you, this might be the referral issue, but the moment a child protection worker is in your life, they're assessing for many other things. And so there's a certain way that through disbelievability, you are disbelieved across the board, across these institutions, and then within child protection. When we're talking about both Black and madness and Black psychiatrists mad, in terms of Black and madness, as I was referring to earlier, Black families have a reasonable and rightful fear of child protection, and the expression of that fear is both maddening and maddened to the point that then police are at your door with these child protection workers. The presence of police is then compounding that fear and that anxiety and those reactions that you might have. But also in terms of Black psychiatrists now, the assessment tools that look at past history or use of substances in a certain way that there are also, in speaking to one child protection lawyer, she said how, this mother had former substance abuse issues and how this was so heavily being taken into account around risk, despite that she wasn't having present issues. However, we also have to look at the means in which these spaces have tried to prove risk or safety concern. And there's the commission called the Mother Risk Commission, and Mother Risk was operated of sick kids where hair follicles were taken from mothers and used to evidence whether they were using substances or not. And there were some mothers who their hair follicles had massive amounts of alcohol in the hair follicles, and so they were saying, well, no, these mothers are neglectful, they're lying to us, all these things. And these mothers are saying, I'm not using substances, this is ridiculous. And actually the case that preceded the Mother Risk Commission, we need to name the person, Elizabeth Julian Wilson, she was the one to really ask substantive questions about this test. She did the research of looking at, well, how was this test made? Who were the test subjects? And it came to be that they never tested on Black women's hairs. They never tested when making the test to see what kind of products Black women might put in their hair that might have high concentrations of alcohol and other kinds of chemicals. And so the test was fraudulent. And so, and would give positive tests when they were incorrect. And so, you know, then we have the Mother Risk Commission, and now they're no longer supposed to be using these kinds of tests. But at the end of the day, the impact, it's already had its impact. Children have been apprehended, families have been fractured. Some of these children have never been reunified or will never reunify. Issue of discipline is a big conversation, where how and if Black parents discipline, and how the safety and risk assessment takes that up. You know, and this does have a relationship to immigration, where on one hand, there's actually a huge, like, before people come to Canada, Black people know about CAS. On the other hand, there is still a not knowing around what Canada has said is what can be disciplined and what it is not. I am not saying that children and youth should experience physical violence, but what I am saying is this disconnect when people come here, not on their part, but from the government, to then call this a safety and risk concern, and not speaking to and having conversations with Black families, and often just taking the most punitive measure, has led to many problems. And in fact, when if you try to give maybe context to maybe why you engage in certain disciplinary practices, from the risk assessment and safety assessment side, that's seen as trying to justify what you did. And now I would not agree with that. I would more so be on the side of understanding that people are trying to give context as to how something happened, and might provide to the worker an understanding that this person is willing to change their practices. They're just letting you know where this come from, and why. On the flip end, we also need to remember that issues of discipline and violent discipline are not a Black phenomenon. They exist across many families and many spaces, but because of the way of carcerality and hyper-surveillance, Black families in particular and Indigenous families are hyper-surveilled around discipline. Interracial relationships and removal from Black families. So I found that when I was doing my research, two of the research participants who had a white mother and a Black father, the Black side of the family was essentially considered closed off from these Black child welfare survivors. There was very little supports given to them. There was very little work around reunification, or if there was, they were quick to pull the kids away. And instead, there was a focus on being very supportive and kind towards the white family, right? And so, you know, there's certain ways in which Black child welfare survivors who've even experienced adoption and maybe have these kind of semi-closed files, often it seems to be the closed part is the Black family, and the open kind of access or possible access in the future is the white side of the family. And all of these reflect anti-Black racism. Again, as I said, around the immigration experience in terms of discipline, but there's also the reality that just by way of being a Black immigrant and coming to Canada, there are literally children who are taken from the moment that they come here because there's been a call to CAS. And, you know, there's even the way that immigration impacts the experience of being in education, and the way that is related to a Black parent being taken up as neglectful because the kid isn't doing well, the Black child isn't, or youth isn't doing well in school. Meanwhile, one, the school system is actually behind in comparison to other spaces that Black people come from, but also two, that there isn't support provided around language services, and also accessibility around understanding that many people come to these conversations in different ways, and the value of tools and education. All of that ends up falling on the Black parent rather than the institutions. Lastly, what I want to talk about is these supervision orders that I talked about, which are the conditions that can be put on Black families. Supervision orders are as to community treatment orders, which come through psychiatric systems, which are as to conditions under probation and parole. If someone can remove people from your lives and tell you what to do and make these invasive calls about who you get to be, this is a carceral experience. And so just because it happens in child welfare, we shouldn't see it as a benefit. Some of these conditions are unreasonable, right? So you have to go to counseling that might actually not be feasible in terms of if you're working multiple jobs. You're not allowed to speak to certain people. That puts, and that might require, then you have to move out of the house, or they will. And so it puts someone in the position of being underhoused, which then becomes a risk. So all of these things are part of a supervision order. Unannounced visits as a part of child welfare practice, we see that in parole and probation. We also see it in community treatment orders. So all of this formulates the anti-Black experience that parents and caregivers have. It's not all of them, some of them. Anti-Black racism for child welfare survivors. This was important for me. As I said, I don't find this is often that people don't remain in these conversations, and often people actually try to detour out of this conversation to validate the fact that they can then be a social worker or have a job around child protection. So displacement and placement, you know, making all these connections. And something I forgot to say is when with the question around earlier, you know, when this comes on your file, is this forever? We have to put all of this in conversation with the history of slavery, right? So the branding that happened towards Black people who were enslaved, the way that Black families are branded by just the very sake of a referral, or branded because of an investigation that may lead to non-verified, or maybe it does lead to verified, and then how that follows the family, and also including the Black child welfare survivor. Displacement and placement for Black child welfare survivors. So being moved around. Often Black child welfare survivors are quickly placed within group homes, which are very carceral sites, far from family, and they experience multiple placements throughout the life of their case in child protection. And so the impacts that has on the self, on the ability to develop relationships, to understand who you are in this Black world. But again, linking that to a history of being able to just move people around, move Black people around as white enslavers, right? So it's a practice that still continues. This is what I meant by enslaving continuities. Carceral discourse. So Black children and youth as child welfare survivors experience terms such as non-compliant and maladjusted. And often resistance is seen as non-compliance and maladjusted. We see this both in the psychiatric system, we see this in the criminal justice system, where if you say you're experiencing something, or you try to challenge things, or you react because of what you're experiencing, you get called these things. Unsafe, so concerns about safety are often related to trauma, but that is equated to being violent. So if Black child welfare survivors are constructed as traumatized, they're considered unsafe because they're seen as violent or possibly violent, rather than trauma as deserving of compassion, care, and understanding. Even very militarized language such as going AWOL, you know, when Black child welfare survivors flee, this is another phenomenon. And so we see all of that. Again, being penalized for asserting their rights. A big part of child welfare, especially within group homes, is the criminalization process of Black child welfare survivors. There's a huge relationship with child welfare system and police, where police are being called by group homes and foster homes for things that are often things that parents should be dealing with or have to deal with, or things that aren't something that a police need to be called for. Group homes as total institutions where children and youth aren't allowed to go outside. They have to be inside for certain times. Their shoes have to go in a certain area locked away. Their belongings go in certain areas locked away. They get pat down. So also considering sexual harassment and assault through these body searches of Black children and youth. And again, linking to other systems such as immigration. And so we see this with the case more recently, such as Abdul Abdi. And he was someone that was taken and apprehended and put through child welfare and experienced so much violence in child welfare, and then is pulled into the criminal justice system, and then after serving time in criminal justice system is being deported. And it took the organizing, frankly, firstly from his family and then from community to push back against this deportation and to name these realities. But this is an example of how these systems are very heavily linked together. And so what I'm saying, or not what I'm saying, the research says, and Black community has talked about for a while now, is despite this place of safety rhetoric throughout the Bill 89 and care, the socioeconomics say otherwise in terms of education, employment, and and experiencing homelessness, and experiencing various forms of violence in the home. So this includes anti-Black racism from staff and peers, you know, the N-word, you know, various forms of anti-Black racism, and containment of bodily autonomy not being provided and I use that term containment as a connection to carcerality, not being provided certain products to care for your body, never being taught so, and not being allowed to have your hair and body look a certain way, being degendered, and then therefore experiencing certain violences, young Black girls having 4 group home staff, you know, restrain and put their knee on their backs and necks, you know, and being degendered in terms of not talking about sexuality as well, or sexuality seen as hypersexuality or asexual, so never having conversations about sexual health, never talking about queer and transness, and actually seeing that as too much or possibly traumatizing. Transracial placement as ongoing genocide, and when I say transracial placement, I mean in white foster homes, white-run group homes, as well as transracial adoption as ongoing genocide. These are spaces that are often not preparing Black children and youth on how to deal with their realities. And they're often sites of violence in themselves. And so we see the example of the Hart family, which was where Jennifer and Sarah Hart, 2 white women, adopted 6 Black children, and in 2018 committed murder-suicide, right? So we see a connection again to the practice of slavery, of putting certain Black, enslaved Black people in the home, and then the level of violence happening in that closed, intimate space. This continues to today. We also need to remember in this apparent Black Lives Matter moment, the impact that this is all having on Black kids who are in these homes that have no capacity to deal with this conversation. And should these children say their Black Lives Matter, that they be penalized. You see issues of colorism or shadeism in the placement of adoption. Lighters often who is being considered as adopting is the white family, and then it's the shade of the child does dictate if they're seen as wanted. As I said, they're undefended and unprepared in these transracial placements. The 21 drop-off is referring to when the government is no longer providing supports to child welfare survivors who are not adopted, and they go into it's like long-term supports, but only until 21. That has a particular impact in terms of financials, where these children and youth, some of them who were 16 and living independently after, when we talk about its connection to psychiatrizing Black and madness, who are also trying to get off of certain medications because of being over-medicated, experiencing all of that while experiencing the 21 drop-off, where the government's not providing any more supports. And then another big part of Black child welfare survivors' experience is anti-Black racism and advocacy, which is, often, these organizations such as the Ontario Child Advocate, such as the Ontario Child Advocate's Office, they were the BLAC project Hair Story was one of the first projects, but was the last project to ever get to put out a report, and the office was already closing down. And so there was no kind of systemic advocacy that continued that report. Also, the way that report was resourced is problematic. So Black youth are often taken, Black child welfare survivors are often taken to be a reference point around how violent these spaces are. People cry, no one does anything. Again, in these advocacy spaces, Black youth child welfare survivors are often criminalized for challenging very neoliberal, respectable approaches to dealing with the realities. If you actually go and you read, and this connects to the Black and Madness, if you go and read the Crossover Youth report, where they're talking about when they're talking about the youth advisory, they're actually talking about Black youth. I'm actually one of those Black young people that was there. And that language that they're using around us, they're really calling us maladjusted and traumatized, despite the fact that we were challenging how anti-Black racism is functioning in that space. That's a phenomenon for Black child welfare survivors. And that leads into always being topic and evidence, but never architects. So everyone's talking about us, everyone's using our experiences, often at the end of the day, their own financial benefit, but we never get to be the architect of our reality. So just so folks know, we will be extending it a little bit because I realize that this part has taken up a lot of time, and I will be wrapping up shortly. So that way I can take questions. There's been anti-Black racism for Black child welfare workers and lawyers. And so anti-Black racism in the workplace for supporting Black families should Black child welfare protection workers do so. We see the case with Children's Aid Society Toronto, where there's a current lawsuit by a former employee. Black child welfare lawyers have had issues of not getting certain referrals for Black families and clients. and also just the experience of this kind of practice is many people don't stay. And part of that is because Black child welfare lawyers are not seen as knowledgeable, including by their own co-counsel if they are partnering someone. This also, when we talk about the child welfare system, we need to talk about social work and legal professions and the education institutions that are often deeply anti-Black, the way that they function. They can't even do this so little as including Black scholarship when it comes to these professions of social work and the legal profession, especially here in Canada, but even how the institution functions. Not invested in educating around anti-Black racism, even though they're supposedly progressive institutions. So we look at Ryerson University with the supposedly most progressive social work program, but there have been consistent issues and calls about anti-Black racism in that space. And so this is where, people are being educated. Even if you look at University of Windsor, before this Black Lives Matter moment, within the Faculty of Law, it was very public that there were issues of anti-Black racism, but we also have to implicate the reality that these institutions will often kind of like sometimes put knowledge in and pull it out. So the University of Windsor Faculty of Law is not offering a child protection course. And so there's a particular way that we aren't then seen as Black child welfare survivors, are not seen as your colleagues. And I'm gonna get into that in a second. This includes the regulatory bodies that create certain standards for people who practice this. So, standards around civility and respect can be deployed against the Black person who makes certain refusals about anti-Black racism and names anti-Black racism. These regulatory bodies can then be used against Black, whether it's students or lawyers or social workers to discipline us out of the profession. And as I said earlier, it's very punitive towards Black child welfare survivors. And we are always seen as your client, and you never see us as your colleague. And I would argue that's because our very presence starts to undo or participates in the undoing of these professions, whether it's social work or law. And so whenever we speak, we are spoken to like we don't know our reality, or we're infantilized and talked about as only trauma. And it becomes discomforting for the people in this profession when we have come to know the language that was used to cause our experiences of lack and harm and in some ways death. It becomes confusing for our colleagues when we now share the language of these professions and we're using that language to undo it. And so we're often disciplined out. Again, go read the Crossover Youth Report. It's a very interesting take on Black child welfare survivors. And we also have to include the legal aid clinic system, and the interaction between staff and Black people seeking services outside of the Black Legal Action Center. When Black people come to you, what is your behavior towards them? Do you see these clients as too much? Do you get frustrated when they talk about what's going on for them? Black people often have many sites of carcerality that include child welfare. Do you hear someone when they come to you about a housing issue that they're also talking about the landlord and tenant trying to, or another tenant trying to deploy child welfare? Do you hear issues around education and child welfare? And do you try to provide comprehensive support or refer so there's comprehensive support? Or do you just kind of deal with the one issue because that's what they came for and that's it? So this leads into BLAC and child protection. So BLAC is actually, while they only take on certain areas of law, they have still interacted with issues with child protection. So we're seeing in housing that property managers, landlords, and other tenants are deploying child protection. We're seeing in education that daycare and education staff are deploying child protection when they're in conflict with Black parents. We're seeing expulsion and suspension often resulting in the calling of CAS. We're seeing in youth criminal justice, CAS is often coupled with a youth criminal justice case. We're seeing Black child protection workers complaining about the conditions they're working under. We're seeing parent calls about children being moved to this date, children being moved to remote areas in Ontario. We're seeing CES being called for children doing work like cooking in the home, right? Cultural, not just a cultural practice, but raising children in a healthy way to be able to maintain themselves and cook for themselves is seen as a negative and neglectful. BLAC has seen, again, this disbelievability as a consistent phenomenon across space and place, including child protection. So the shape of child protection now in Ontario: Office of Ontario Child Advocate closed, Crossover Youth closed, One Mission, One Voice closed. So what does this mean, right? So we're seeing certain things that maybe were meant to or intended to attend to Black life and child welfare closed. And so when we talk about neoliberalism, we need to think about what all of this means, and who it's going to impact and how it's going to heavily impact based on these already existing realities. When I looked at the ombudsman, they're not, I would argue, giving good data, but the data they do give, they say they received 23,600 complaints, and the complaints are about issues involving their placements, treatment by staff and other youth in their residence, and difficulties in transitioning out of care. So we're seeing all of this still happening. And we also need to compound this, I didn't have the time, with COVID-19 and what this means. We're also hearing Children's Aid Societies denying service to youth age 16 or 17 who are trying to get services. Many are complaining about their safety where they are, and living too far away from family, and feel that they weren't being treated properly. So, like, the shape of child protection where it is now is I would argue we are still in this long emancipation in the context of child welfare, where these anti-Black conditions are still going, and care is so deeply entwined with carcerality. So I left this slide blank. The reason being is because I knew I was probably going to be running out of time. So what I want to say is, resistance there's always been resistance by Black child welfare survivors and families. I would argue Black child welfare survivors trying to run from violent group homes, they might be called AWOL, but that's still resistance. And that's a style of resistance that does harken back to when Black people would flee the plantation and flee for their freedom from those who have enslaved them, right? So that, I would argue that is resistance. I think it's resistance for Black child welfare survivors on their own, often, to try to get off of being over-medicated, to figure out how they're going to build relationships and the violence they experience from all of those relationships, and how they're going to heal from that into adults and the lifelong consequence of that. That's resistance. I think Black child welfare survivors finding their families and the families finding them is resistance, because often that is made the most difficult process. I think it's resistance when Black mothers and Black parents challenge CAS and pull in community supports like collective child welfare survivors, like myself, like BLAC, to name the realities and help them name the realities and push back against what's happening. I would argue it's resistance in some ways for Black families to not necessarily listen to what the law says and listen to what we know, and try to support one another, whether that's the practice of other mothering or what have you. Again, my research does look at resistance, and I name it more in depth, but this is what I'm going to say for now based on time. So future considerations for Black families, folks need to be asking themselves, you need to ask yourselves these questions. I can't, I already have. What does this all mean when we talk about the ongoing history of slavery for Black families, children, and youth in this province and country, and child welfare? Like, what does this actually mean? Well, we obviously need to radically rethink what supporting Black families look like. We obviously need to dislocate and remove carcerality from care. When we have these calls for abolition, we need to be child welfare abolitionists. Again, this is coming from me and my work and my research. We need to have an abolitionist perspective when it comes to child welfare. That doesn't mean that we don't think and reimagine new possibilities for Black families and caring for ourselves and one another. And my last thing is, stop monetizing Black child welfare survivors for your personal gain, whether it's your research, whether that's the place that you work. Do you ever see yourself without being a job, or is the only time you have a job requiring a Black family, child, youth being in despair, lack, or dying, or dead? And so I will leave folks with that. If you go to the next slide, these are the resources. They will be publicly posted. So now I'm going to, and the references are after that. In terms of the references, I put references specific to child welfare. And then if you go to the next slide, these references, a lot of people will always ask me, how have I come to think about these things in particular ways? This is not everyone that I've read, but I think for me, these authors and writers help me definitely rethink myself and rethink anti-Black racism and rethink child welfare. And so that will all be available to you. So now I'm going to take questions and drink some water.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh. So there are a variety of different questions and comments, but I think for time, I'll focus mostly on the questions. Okay, So one person wants you to repeat the person who coined or speaks about monstrous bodies.
Christina Sharp. That'd be
Christina.
Dr. Christina Sharp. I don't reference that work, but I do reference her in it for her book In the Wake. So her name's there, so you can look that up.
Christina Sharp.
Yeah.
Okay. And another question. Somebody wants you to maybe re-explain what the millennial scoop is all about. Millennial scoop.
The millennium scoop is referring to the current time period that we are in, so the 2000s, as social workers going in and scooping up and taking Indigenous children and youth and apprehending them from their families, and at more rates than when there was the 60s scoop. Often, actually, Black folks have been using the term when referencing child welfare as the new slave catchers. That has been the term within Black folks and Black community and Black organizing community to reference that.
Okay. So just a quick comment that somebody says here that they thought you made a really good point about Black women being considered good enough to mother and raise white children, but not considered capable of raising their own. And they just say thanks for the presentation, that it was enlightening and well presented. But another question here is, do you think that the problems that Black families and youth experience can be extrapolated to issues that Indigenous families and youth experience? Why or why not? And if so, which issues would be similar?
Yeah, so as I said with my land acknowledgement or my Black and Indigenous solidarity kind of commitment, Black and Indigenous people experience systems and structures in similar ways and in different and distinct ways. I don't think everything can be conflated. I don't, the process of racialization does not racialize us in the same ways. We therefore don't have the same experiences. Institutions don't take up our experiences in the same way. And I think that's important to understand. I don't think you can always just take out Black and add Indigenous and it's going to be the same thing. And so that is to say, if you're interested in the experience of Indigenous children, youth, and families as it comes to child welfare, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many Indigenous authors have talked about, child welfare. So I do implore folks to go read up on the specificity of Indigenous peoples here.
Okay. Somebody wants to know if you have any stats on inaccurate referrals to inaccurate referrals, such as like how many times the school, daycare, hospital get it right when referring a child to seek child protection, and how many times do they get it wrong? Are there stats available for that?
I don't. I've never looked that up. I actually don't even know if you'd even be able to have access to that. I would argue maybe an inquiry, maybe from, if you're listening, Ontario Human Rights Commission, an inquiry into the accuracy around referrals. However, I think it's also important to, even if a referral is accurate, I think we need to question, I think another important question is, even if it's accurate, that's not necessarily a good thing. Like, if you understand, if we've gone through this presentation, we understand, if we've complicated the process for referral, and what's considered neglectful or abuse can be quite problematic. And so the referral can be accurate and yet can still be so damaging and harmful.
Okay, thank you. And another question here. So would you be able to speak to Bill C-92 and how it has been successful or unsuccessful at addressing white supremacy and racism within child welfare system in so-called Canada? How might this be good or bad precedent for Black families interacting with the child welfare system?
When it comes to Bill C-92, I haven't read into that too much. And so I'm not going to comment on it. Also, both for the sake of time and for the reality of, I don't want to say anything without being informed. So unfortunately, I can't answer this question. My apologies.
Okay. So there are other questions that are more for you, Josh, but maybe they can be answered separately outside of this webinar.
Well, I kind of see them. I can kind of blast them really quickly if you'd like me to.
Okay. Sure, go ahead.
So in terms of published work, my research is being published in a book forthcoming, hopefully December. The book is going to be called Child Welfare and the Myth of Protection. and my research is called From Topic and Evidence to Architect, the Resistive Strategies of Black Child Welfare Survivors. I have a few other things in the works, so I don't have timelines and dates yet, but yes, stay tuned. You know, I have works talking about hopefully coming out around anti-Black racism in access to justice law as a profession and pedagogy. So yeah, stay tuned. Seeing a lot of thanks. You're welcome. Okay, is that the only question that was left?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's no other questions really, but a lot of thank yous for the excellent presentation, Josh.
Okay, well, so thank you everyone to those who tuned in, and you know, I would say stay tuned to what's happening around child welfare, especially, you know, not to plug a group that I've co-founded, but, you know, Collective Child Welfare Survivors. Stay tuned to Black organizers who are trying to complicate our abolitionist perspective and approaches in organizing, including child welfare. Yeah, and if you have any questions, you can always engage BLAC, whether it's a legal question or a question about some of the stuff here, and it can be filtered to me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.